Hello, everybody.
Welcome to another episode of the Pauper Premier League. I'm Alex Ullman. I'm here with a very special guest host. Mind introducing yourself, Charles?
Sure. Got Charles up there, but most of you probably know me as Birdman or Entropy263, the Tron guy.
You are the Tron guy. So Charles is Pauper streamer. You've won. How many challenges have you won in Pauper?
I believe 3, actually.
And you have been doing a lot of work on the Tron decks, the decks that we actually haven't seen a ton of in this league. We still have 3 more weeks of play before the playoffs, so maybe someone will bring a Tron list out that involves Ghostly Flicker or Ephemerate or these kind of hard blocks at the end of the game. So do you mind talking about those decks a little bit? I mean, we haven't seen them a lot they're kind of a big now.
Yeah, sure. So right now, I was the only one at the forefront for a little bit, but Hellsal has popped up with his own Tron list. But basically, it just features the best late game engine in all of Pauper with Wall, Pulse of Marasa, and a Flicker effect. So whenever your wall dies, you can pulse it back and get your pulse back with wall. And then flickers generate value, and when you have 2 walls set up, you get back every spell.
Mnemonic wall?
Mnemonic wall to get back spells of 5 mana. And then with addition of Astrolabe and Ephemerate, the deck has just gotten far more consistent. You can have an entirely untapped mana base, which speeds up the entire deck by an entire turn. The Astrolabes allow you to just really snowball your mana base, and you no longer have the issue that Tron lands used to have of your colors were restricted and people could fight you on that basis.
Yeah. So for those of you who aren't as into Pauper, what these decks do is they kind of take the first 3 to 4 turns to set up, establish their mana. And then what ends up happening is they end up in kind of this hard lock. I see my videos flickering in and out. You get Mnemonic Wall, which when it enters the battlefield, you can return a creature, an instant or sorcery to your hand. You get Ephemerate or Ghostly Flicker, and what you can do is you can start looping and basically tutoring your graveyard for spells. For those of you who were here with week 1 and saw week 2 and saw Joseph Varani's familiar combo deck, it's that same engine, but now you can do it far more often thanks to the abundance of mana provided by Tron. And Ephemerates provide this thing where you only need to use 1 mana to basically draw a card from your graveyard and then get back the Ephemerate, right?
Yeah, that's one of the other biggest deals with Ephemerate. So before you needed 2 Mnemonic Walls with a Ghostly Flicker in order to be able to buy back a spell. Yeah. So against aggro, your only game plan is to cast Moment's Peace and fog them out. But now it used to be really hard to assemble wall, flicker, and a fog before the aggro player kills you. But now you just need 1 single wall and 1 Ephemerate and a fog, which both can be tutored through Mystical Teachings, 1 copy of it. So it's a whole lot easier to assemble. There's far less pieces to it, which has made the deck just even more powerful.
So you talked a little bit about the version and the Hellsal version. So what is the win condition in the version you champion?
There's usually 3 or so win conditions, technically a 4th, but the big ones are going to be your De Nova Horror, flicker all of your opponent's permanents off the table, Rolling Thunder for damage because you can buy it back with wall as much as you need, and you have Tron mana at 20 a turn. And then there's also Capsize, get all your permanents. And then the 4th one, which doesn't come up very often, but Mortuary Mire, flicker wall and mire, get your creature back, discard your creature ad nauseum until your opponent runs out of cards in their deck.
That sounds like it takes a while.
It does, but when the Elves player is at 700 life, it's your only choice.
Sure. What, you're not going to just get back Rolling Thunder every turn and then take your time. And then the Hellsal version, that's the one that runs Stonehorn Dignitary, right?
Yes. So the big differences between ours is I have 2 copies of Teachings and basically more flashback spells to fight through counter spells, whereas Hellsal's, you'll see Stonehorn Dignitaries and extra copies of Ghostly Flicker in those places. Okay. So his is far less, there's no flashback spells. He's on 1 Teachings and nothing else. So he's just relying on drawing the combo off the top while I have tutors. Okay. But he has more raw combo pieces.
So this deck is kind of, it's that extreme top end of the metagame. It kind of tries to, it's really hard to go over the top of Tron because it sounds like you have this really strong end game. Sounds like you really kind of have after turn 5, if you have assembled the pieces, the game's kind of on lockdown. What are the pinch points of the deck? You mentioned that mana used to be the pinch point, but what's the case now?
Now, so it really depends on the build. So Halsal's build, it's obviously tuned for aggro deck, so he's going to be having a better matchup versus them. But I did do a bit of testing with this list, and it's a bit softer to just a pile of counter spells. He doesn't have the flashback spells to 2-for-1 you anymore. So if you can counter his card advantage, you can usually find a way to win if you assemble your own Archaeomancer Ephemerate as a control deck. My particular list is actually a bit softer to aggro decks that have a way to get past my fog, as I can get flamed fairly easily if I'm not quite set up, like turn 5. I've got my fog, and you have the 17 power creature if you're Boggles or your Affinity, and then you just fling me before I'm fully set up, and that's a pretty big weak point.
So you mentioned aggro decks, and speaking of aggro decks, we got 3 of them in the field tonight. So what we have is our first match is going to be Brian DeMars. If we could pull up the match schedule, we're going to have Brian DeMars versus Brian Koval. And Brian DeMars is on a fairly typical stompy mono-green aggro build, while Brian Koval is on first of all, the first Tron deck we've seen, and it's a little bit of a different Tron deck. So this is, sometimes called Snow White Tron or Skyfisher Tron, or I think Brian's calling it Tronarch. So what's this deck trying to do, Charles?
So this deck, I think it was made by M. Lovebow, but don't quote me on that. So this deck is actually a pretty interesting one. It's a Skyfisher deck first and a Tron deck in second.
Okay.
It really reminds me of the list a few years ago, the Tron decks that didn't really run Expedition Map. So it had this control game plan back then, but now it's the Skyfisher game plan. So your game plan is to resolve your creatures by time, and instead of digging for Tron, you're going to draw into it naturally eventually, and it's going to power your end game instead of it being your game. So turn 1 Astrolabe is far more important than turn 1 Urza's Tower.
Okay. Then we have Andreas Peterson on, Boggles or Hexproof, and the big thing here is that he looks like he's borrowed from the list that was popular before the Grand Prix LA MCQ, which is just the Forest and Crumbling Vestige. But he also has added, in addition to the Abundant Growth and the Utopia Sprawl, looks like he's added 4 copies of Arkham's Astrolabe, which you mentioned makes the deck slightly more consistent.
Yeah, so Boggles has always had an issue with consistency. It doesn't really have a way to draw cards. It's got 8 enchantments that they really, really need, Ethereal Armor and Ancestral Mask. Otherwise, they just typically don't have the power to get there. So in order to fix their mana and get to those spells, the Astrolabe kind of does both. It's allowing them to generate white for their Ethereal Armor, but it's also drawing a card to dig to those 8 more consistently.
Yeah, I know in some builds we've seen cards like Heliod's Pilgrim to find those, or we've seen some builds run Commune with Nature, or I think going back a ways we've seen Krufix's Insight. And this is slightly different than some of the other builds we've seen with Arkham's Astrolabe, which have run the Skyfisher package. Do you have a take on that? Which do you think is better, the Skyfisher Boggles or just the more traditional Boggles?
So I think it really depends. So the 2 big things are, if my opponent's running Counterspell, I really like the Skyfisher package because it just adds that extra redundancy. You can grind your opponent down. You're fighting their Skyfishers with your own Skyfishers. So you just have more creatures that require an answer. But if I'm playing against like Stompy in particular, or other aggro decks, and possibly, I guess, mono black maybe. Well, probably not mono black. This is a bad matchup. But decks where I just want to do my own thing, Skyfishers typically, you're spending 2 mana, just 2 to 3 mana to cycle a card, and you're just not interested in that. So you would rather have redundant pieces and be a bit more consistent without it.
And the last deck I'm playing tonight, also, I'm playing Black-Green Aristocrats. I'll be honest, I tested a bunch of weird Reanimator decks trying to get something to work for this week. None of it worked. I tried Tortured Existence, and I realized that one person might run Tron, and I don't want to be the person running Tortured Existence into Tron, especially, this late at night for me. So I went back to a deck that I'd had some success with. It's a Carrion Feeder deck, so I get to run that. It's a Mortician Beetle deck. And I picked a deck that's basically 50% against everything I'm facing tonight. So it's going to come down to what I think are a lot of coin flips and my opening hand.
Yeah, I'm actually going to have to trust you on that one. That's the one deck I'm not really familiar with. I know it's kind of your project, and I just don't really see it that often. So
Yeah, it's a pet project of mine. I've put a lot of work into this list. I think a few months ago, someone went 5-0 in the competitive league back before the leagues were combined. Someone with the name of Vampire Garlic Pizza. I remember this because Aaron Campbell pointed that out to me on Twitter that was their name, and they have a couple 5-0s to their name.
It's quite the name.
It's Magic Online. Everyone, you can be whoever you want to be. You can, yeah. I don't know where I was going with that, so we'll just roll with it. But the one thing I noticed is that the mana wasn't great, and we'll get to that later because I think we're ready for our first match, which is Brian versus Brian.